Hello, everybody. As everybody's making their way in, we're going to go ahead and kick off our fourth and final installment. So I want to welcome everyone to the fourth and final cultural conversation installment for this academic year. My name is Kayla Duncan, Vice President of the African American Faculty and Staff Coalition, as well as Assistant Director of Counsel and Testing here at Francis Marion. It is our hope as a coalition that these conversations have served as an educational tool to increase not only knowledge of the complexities of culture, but also best daily practices within the classroom as well as other pertinent settings. This series could not have happened without the fantastic partnership with Dr. Carter, FMU Communications, Airmark, FMU Psychology Department, FMU Sociology Department. Thank you all for believing in our mission, Together We Can. Today's speaker is Dr. Todd Couch, Assistant Professor of Sociology here at Francis Marion. Dr. Couch is a sociologist and a scholar of race and ethnicity who bridges the gap between academia and the larger society by offering practical application of sociological knowledge. He is a skilled speaker and researcher whose work is rooted in the understanding that increased awareness of social issues is the first step toward creating more equitable organizations, communities, and ultimately societies. Dr. Couch's research focuses on examining racial and ethnic relations in the U.S. from various theoretical perspectives and has been featured in peer-reviewed journals in the U.S. and the U.K. So before I bring up Dr. Couch, I just want to do some housekeeping. Remind everybody that we will have a brief Q&A session right after his speech. If you want to come up to the podiums here on each side to ask questions. If you're online on the live stream, you can type in your question and our mediator will say it out loud for him to answer. And then after that, we'll close. If you're looking for CEUs, if you're online, that'll be emailed to you in person. You'll just go up to the registration table to fill that out at the end. And so if you all have a hand and welcome Dr. Todd Couch to speak with us today.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank y'all for coming out today. I also like to extend a very special thank you to everybody that prepared the meal that we all had today. It was wonderful, and thank you for all of your efforts. I would also like to thank the coalition for asking me to come speak today, that this speaker series has done something very important for our community, that it has given us the opportunity to talk. And we may be thinking, well, this is not necessarily a spectacular thing. It's not necessarily extraordinary to engage in dialogue, but we exist in a very interesting moment where engaging in meaningful discourse is hard. That we exist in a moment where if we don't like the things that people say, we can get this little thing out and we can block or we can unfollow, and that we can stop the very thing that has propelled us forward as a civilization. Engaging in meaningful dialogue with one another. And so I would like to thank everybody from the coalition for organizing this, to thank you, this opportunity, it matters. So as I was preparing for the talk today, I felt a little bit of pressure being the fourth and final speaker. Don't drop the ball, is what I kept saying to myself. And as I was driving to work one day, I tend to listen to podcasts, and a new podcast with two of my personal heroes, Bruce Springsteen and Barack Obama, started, called Renegades Born in the USA. And as I was listening to that podcast, we have Barack Obama and Bruce Springsteen are sitting around a table with a microphone, drinking bourbon, telling stories about their lives. And ultimately, towards the end of the first episode, Springsteen starts to tell the story of writing his 1984 song, My Hometown. In My Hometown, if you're unfamiliar with it, the first verse opens and Springsteen is talking about the beauty of the town he grew up in New Jersey. Then eventually he moves into the second verse, and in the second verse, he details the story of a hate crime that people he went to high school committed. The story, in essence, is a couple of white guys pulled up next to a black guy at a stoplight and shot him. He then, in the third verse, starts to detail the economic decline of his New Jersey town and closes out the song with a father putting his son behind the wheel of a Buick and saying, "This is your hometown." And as Springsteen is recounting this story, he says, the story has evolved as time has gone on, because as he has spent time touring and talking with people, his hometown is a lot like a lot of our hometowns. That our hometowns have these beautiful, wonderful dynamics, yet they can also possess these dark and ugly components. And that what is proposed is that we are forever linked to our hometowns. And that our hometown is not necessarily just a zip code. That we can expand it to even include the national borders in which we exist. The good, the bad, we're all forever connected to it. And that as the people who exist today, we have the responsibility of shepherding our hometown. So the title of my talk today is Space, Place, and Belonging: The United States' Struggle with Inclusion. Because if you've had the wonderful opportunity, and if you have not, I encourage you to do so, to listen to the previous speakers in this series. They're probably better than I am. But there's a recurring trend about us as a country navigating experiences with each other, detailing what it means to exist within this American space. Who belongs? Who does not? How do we treat each other? And so in our talk today, I will be exploring the experiences of two ethnic groups: Latino Americans and Asian Americans. But ultimately, the goal is to look at how these two specific ethnic groups have been a part of this American story in relationship to the state, as well as popular culture. That what we are hoping to do is to eventually discuss the way in which both of these groups have resisted times in which expanse was not so welcoming, times in which inclusivity was not at the forefront of our minds. And then ultimately, we will conclude much of our time together by looking at things that we can do in our hometown to make it a more equitable and a more inclusive space. So as we begin this journey together, I think it is important that we spend a couple of moments talking about terminology, because words matter. They communicate things about value and worth and how we view other people. That through this talk, I will use the language of Latino, in large part because within racial and ethnic studies, this is the language that is most commonly used to refer to people connected to Latin America, people of Mexican descent, people from South America. But I have to say that at this moment, we are exploring different types of terminology. You may have heard it recently in popular culture. The terminology is Latinx. Latinx. And what this terminology is seeking to do is to call into question the way in which the masculine is promoted within language, in an attempt to create more equality in the very words that we use to refer to ourselves and to other people. But broadly speaking, the two groups that we will be referring to today can be thought of as ethnogroups. That these are, in essence, collections of people who can stem from very different national origins, but possess certain cultural similarities. Many times there can be more differences, but there are some similarities, perhaps things such as language, certain cultural holidays, some of the things that I tend to be interested in, like food. So broadly speaking, we will be talking about ethnogroups today. So I think a great place to start is looking at experiences with the state. Now, as someone who studies social movements, when we refer to the state, what we most often are referring to is any type of governmental structure. This does not necessarily mean a federal government or a state government. It can get even smaller than that. And so, due to our time constraint, we will have snapshots of some of these interactions. And so, specifically, I wanted to take a moment to talk about the experience of lynching and the shared history that both of these groups have with this ugly part of our hometown. That it's a part that is a little familiar to us, given geographically where we exist in the American South. That this ritual of lynching is something that did not necessarily happen the way that it is often depicted in film and in other forms of media, under moonlight carried out by 2 or 3 perpetrators. That more often than not, this thing of lynching was a cultural practice carried out in broad daylight, often in town squares. It is very well documented that you could have people going to church on Sunday morning and then having their Sunday lunch in the town square while the lynching was taking place, in which men, women, and children all took part. That this egregious action ultimately served a social function of designating who belonged in space, how welcoming and inclusive we sought to be in that moment. Not very much so. Well, as we expanded west, we took this practice with us. As we move into my home state of Texas, we start to see hundreds of Mexicans and people of Mexican descent subjected to the same brutal ritual. There are estimates that upwards of 600 to 700 people of Mexican descent in the state of Texas were subjected to this brutal ritual of defining space and place. A couple that are worthwhile are Rogelio Ramirez, happened in 1880. Rogelio, his wife, and his daughter, Maria Inez, were captured by a group of about 30 people, taken into the middle of town, subjected to this ritual under the accusation of, quote, bewitching a neighbor. You think about Augustine Aguilar, who was subjected to the same brutality after reporting a neighbor for shooting his dog. Another notable example is Elias Zaraste, happened in 1922, 99 years ago, not even quite 100. Victimized for getting into a verbal altercation with a co-worker. 10 guys rounded him up, took him to the town square, and everyone participated. As we continue to expand westward, we start to see similar actions occurring against people of Asian descent. In one event that is known as the Chinese Massacre of 1871, what happened was two groups of Chinese individuals had got into an altercation with one another. And unfortunately, multiple people lost their lives in this incident, but the important part in this story is that a white bystander lost their life. And the narrative began to circulate around this new town called Los Angeles that whites were being killed wholesale. As this narrative circulated, it caused people to organize, and unfortunately, it's estimated 500 people go into old Chinatown, begin to murder, rob, and sexually assault the citizens of this community. It is well known in scholars of LA history that around 30 people definitively lost their lives that day. But that does not necessarily account for all the additional trauma that was inflicted on that community, all within the name of saying who belongs, who has a right to this space. Another way in which we see our two groups in question today interacting with the state is as it relates to immigration policy, something we still talk about today, many years later. That a few notable examples can include the Chinese Exclusion Act, that the motivation for this was very similar to motivations that we can hear propagated today. That the narrative was Chinese people are taking all of our jobs. There are no jobs for people who are natively born. Something has to be done. So in 1882, we have on the federal level the Chinese Exclusion Act signed and put into place that makes Chinese immigration to our country completely forbidden. This also included incidents in which you were a Chinese American but went home to visit family and were not allowed back into the country. Shortly after the passage of the act in 82, we see the Jerry Act is passed. The Jerry Act then extended the Chinese Exclusion Act another 10 years and looked at India and said, people from you are not welcome. And looked at the Middle East and said, people from here are not welcome. Now, just shortly after Chinese Exclusion Act is shot down in the courts, we start to see the story of Japanese internment put into place right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Taking U.S. citizens of Asian descent, putting them into de facto concentration camps, and saying this space is not yours anymore. Where you were living does not belong to you. You had no rights to this place. That you're now being set off as separate from everybody else. At the same time internment is starting, there's something interesting happening on the federal level that we're having the U.S. government and the Mexico government starting this thing called the Bracero program. What the Bracero program sought to do was to supplement the various American citizens who had gone to fight in war with Mexican labor. So through the Bracero program, through its life, we had 4.6 million people from Mexico come in to work largely in the labor sector, significantly in the state of California. But ultimately, shortly after, we're told, you don't belong. Through the greatest, by greatest I mean largest, not qualitatively greatest, through the largest immigration act that we've had and had at that moment, the U.S. government enacted in 1954 what is referred to as Operative How do we as a community, and I don't mean Florence, I mean collective society, how do we as a community justify and make sense of some of these things? And that in many ways it comes down to the stories that we tell. It comes down to the imagery that we can consume. Because the thing about images is that images carry messages. Images and depictions and stereotypical portrayals communicate things about how we view other people. They communicate things about the worth and the value that is socially ascribed. And perhaps one thing that's worth noting is the specific ways in which the imagery and the portrayals of Latino Americans and Asian Americans has shifted and evolved over time to completely align with narratives about things such as immigration, work, and labor. So if you were to go back and look at depictions of Asian Americans from the early 1800s, you would often see particularly Asian American men depicted as incredibly effeminate. Incredibly effeminate. We can jump up until we start to get into World War II, move into Vietnam even. We see this story start to change. The stories that the pictures tell change. That the man of Asian descent shifts in these depictions from being effeminate to being hypersexual, hyper-violent. In many ways, in part with the cultural narrative that they were seeking to, in so many ways, assault white women. And this imagery persists all the way through the 1980s. Then we move back into a more modern time where the narrative has swung back to the other direction of effeminization. That if you are familiar with pop culture in some ways, there was a film that came out several years ago, it was a trilogy even, titled The Hangover. And in The Hangover, there is a primary character named Leslie Chow. Leslie Chow is played by Kim Jong. Throughout the trilogy, there's the recurring joke that this character, who in his posture, in his dress, is often presented as very feminine. He carries a purse. It's a recurring joke whenever they're exchanging drug money many times. And then even in the second Hangover movie, there is a scene that includes fake full frontal nudity, in which Leslie Chow is depicted as having, quote, a baby strawberry-sized penis. Complete emasculation of this individual, in many ways aligned with cultural narratives. This parallels the things that we would see play out with the idea in popular culture of the subservient, submissive woman of Asian descent. The other side of that coin, in many ways, being the fiery, hypersexual Latina displayed by Eva Longoria on Desperate Housewives. That these stereotypes communicate things about the ways in which we can see people. But there's been a fascinating change occurring culturally with many of these depictions, is that the very person that played Leslie Chow, Kim Jong, has now gone on to start writing and producing his own stories. And so over the last 10 years, and in many ways it started on television with the television show Blackish, we started to have more people of color telling their own stories in a way that normalizes their experiences, that says that we are not caricatures just set out for consumption, that we have families that we love, we have professions that we love, we're just living life like everybody else. That it's worth noting that even in recent years, as we look at things like the Oscars, we're noticing places where people telling their own stories is getting more attention. Kim Jong, who I mentioned again earlier, was in a movie called Rich Young Asians, which swept the Oscars a few years back, about Asian people telling their own stories through their own cultural lenses in a way that is humanizing, that is very different than, if you've been paying attention to the news over the last 2 weeks, some of the imagery that we can see depicted historically in places like Dr. Seuss books, where we are finding people of Asian descent or Mexican descent depicted to children in very stereotypic ways. But we shouldn't be surprised at the way in which this storytelling is emerging, because in so many ways it reflects this much larger history of resistance. That throughout these encounters with the West and expansion, we have always had Latino communities and Asian American communities finding ways to resist much of the racism that they were beginning to, or they'd been experiencing. And we can observe it in places with things like civil disobedience and labor strikes. Labor strikes were incredibly significant given the specific economic role that many of the people in these communities found themselves playing in our culture and in our society. But a few that are of personal interest to myself include the Chicano movement, largely taking place in the state of California. That we see the emergence of a group called the Brown Berets. The Brown Berets in so many ways are very similar to the Black Panthers, that they took much of their inspiration from the Panthers. That when David Sanchez founded this group in 1966, he said, you know what we're interested in? Safe schools. We're interested in the police not harassing our communities. They even went on to establish medical clinics, meal programs for the kids in their communities, all as a way of resisting much of the racism they were experiencing. So that in spite of these things, the Brown Berets organized. And unfortunately, similar to the Panthers, they found themselves ultimately beginning to dissolve as we move into the 80s and 90s due to different personalities taking leadership positions. But the initial thing that caused them to organize, I think we could agree, is something rather beautiful: loving and caring for one's own community. At the similar time as we're seeing the Brown Berets organize, we also start to see this thing called Chicano nationalism start to present itself. That very similar to Black nationalism. What we start to have are people, again, largely in California, saying that my worth as a Latin American is not necessarily tied to the way that I'm treated by the country in which I exist. Beginning to advocate for things like a Latin American nation within the United States. Use the term Aztlan. Aztlan was a space that would extend from what we can think of as the state of Texas all the way up into Utah. A space in what was at one point old Mexico, taken back, where people would have the freedom to live on their own terms again. And shortly after, we start to see the Chicano movement, see the Asian American movement starting on the East Coast up in Manhattan in 1970s. And a specific motivating factor for the establishment of this specific movement was that in Manhattan, you had a very specific Asian American neighborhood that was being neglected by City Hall. Streets were falling apart, schools weren't being funded, street lights were out. So they came together and organized, began to protest, marched on City Hall multiple times, and said that we won't be ignored, that we have a right to this space. We contribute to the economics. And in a more modern time, we have seen a rise in digital activism for most groups of marginalized groups. But specifically drawing attention to things related to immigration in the American South. If you've taken any notice of immigration bills moving through the state of Arizona, a lot of this has been caught on social media. That the state of Arizona was effectively given the right to stop any brown person that they thought, quote, looked illegal. Much of these stories were circulated using social media as a way to tell the story and to organize and to march on City Hall and the Capitol. Ultimately, this immigration law in the state of Arizona was struck down as unconstitutional. But the way in which it gained steam, the way in which it gained national attention, was through social media. So through our time, we're not done yet. So through our time, I think we can see that our hometown, our communities, we have not always been the most inviting, the most inclusive, the most welcoming. But that does not mean that we can just leave it there. That as the people who exist today, it is our responsibility to do what we can to create a more equitable and inclusive community. And the question always becomes, well, what do we do? Because if you are someone that considers yourself to be justice and equity minded, interested in justice, what we can sometimes find ourselves wanting to do is to just change everything overnight. Completely change the whole social structure overnight. It sounds good, but often that's not the way that change happens. That change is often a very incremental march that we go on. As one of my friends calls it, sometimes it's an unsteady march. A couple steps forward, a couple steps back, but we keep going. And so one way in which we can begin to take those steps at creating that more inclusive and equitable space is through starting to explore these ideas of unconscious bias. Start at a very individual level. If you're unfamiliar with the term of unconscious bias, what it is, in a nutshell, is our ability to do hurtful things to others and exclusionary things to others unintentionally, without thinking about it. In many ways, because throughout our lives we have been exposed to these narratives and these storylines about this group of people and that group of people. And then if someone walks by our car, we can lock the car real fast and not even think about it. And so as we start to think about what we can do to create more equitable and inclusive communities, I think implicit bias is a great place to start the conversation. Now, as a social scientist, I'm very interested in evidence-based proposals for fixing things. And some of the best research on implicit bias suggests that if we want to counteract this thing, we have to treat it like a habit, a bad habit, but a habit no different than anything else. That disrupting that feedback cycle is what we must do. And so as I talk with students often about this specific topic, I tell them that we have to have realistic expectations. We must have realistic expectations about the change that will occur and the time frame in which the change will occur. That it takes time. And we have to give each other the grace as we work through our own baggage. Because we all got it. But as we enter into this conversation, there's a couple of things about our own posture that is essential if this implicit bias feedback loop will be interrupted. The first is that we have to be aware of our own biases, that we have to have a legitimate desire to do it. And this is sometimes the more difficult aspect of engaging with implicit bias, is that I can't make you do the work and you can't make me do the work. That it requires the individual to have an authentic desire to unpack their baggage. We have to be willing to explore those specific moments. We can call them triggers if we'd like to. Those specific triggers that can cause us to present a stereotypic response. And we have to be willing to embrace the tools that are proven to work at disrupting the cycle. So the first tool that is important in disrupting this implicit bias feedback loop is called stereotype replacement. Stereotype replacement. And what this requires us as individuals to do is to take a step back and evaluate many of our actions. That when the person walks close to me and I clutch my purse when they get in the elevator, having the courage to say, why did I clutch my purse with that person? What is it about this specific interaction that is causing me to respond in that specific way? And after the reflection, ultimately what we will try to do is to create a new response that says, I'm not going to automatically lock my doors when a black or a brown person walks by my car. Now remember that time frame and those realistic expectations. That sometimes it can take people years to move through this first step. But you can keep working through it. It's a slow and it's a steady march. The next tool is called counter-stereotypic imaging. Another way to think about that is finding different images of a group that counter the racist and stereotypic imaging that we've seen in the past. And so I use the example often with students of, say, Michelle Obama to counteract the image of a poor black mother that is propagated so often in media. It's taking these other examples of groups of people and embracing those, because what ultimately will happen is that these will become salient and will shape our responses. So rather than seeing a black woman and assuming, again, that she's a poor black mother, like we would see on television, we start saying, no, that's not necessarily the case. That I know or know of people who do not fit that trend. And our actions can then begin to fall in line with that counter-stereotypic image. The next tool is called individuation. Individuation is effectively getting to know people. What we're doing, talking, dialogue, discourse, doing life with people different than ourselves is a huge way in which we can disrupt implicit bias. Because there's a thing in sociological theory called attribution theory. And what attribution theory suggests is that if we don't know things about somebody or about a group, we attribute characteristics to them. Do you think we attribute positive or negative characteristics to people we don't know? We tend to attribute negative characteristics. So through getting to know people, we can also disrupt this feedback loop of this habit. The next tool that we can explore is perspective taking. This is when we try to do what we tell children and put ourselves in someone else's shoes to the best of our abilities. Put ourselves in someone else's shoes and say, if I had someone lock the door on me as I walked by their car, how would that make me feel? This type of self-conscious reflection can be useful in disrupting the cycle. And lastly, we have to increase opportunities to be with people different than ourselves. We have to increase opportunities. This is called contact theory, actually. We have to increase opportunities to spend time and invest into relationships with people that look different than ourselves, speak different than ourselves, and believe different than ourselves. Because that can disrupt this feedback loop. That very similar to Springsteen, as he's talking about his hometown, there's some great stuff and there's some bad stuff. And we're forever connected to it all. But as the people that exist today, we have a responsibility to the space, to the place, making it an environment where people feel that they belong. Thank you.
That was just, I don't even have words. So we're going to go ahead and start the Q&A portion. If you are online on live stream, you can type your questions. If you're in person, please come up to the mic and ask your question for Dr. Couch.
Dr. Couch, thank you for that fine presentation. When it comes to reducing stereotypes, how much obligation do people have to confront stereotypes when we hear them or see them in terms of interpersonal confrontation?
That is a question that comes up often, so I was waiting for it. And it's a two-sided answer. Because on one side, I would say, yes, we need to engage when we hear people using stereotypic language. But I also think it is important that we have those realistic expectations. Because if you're not interested, if the person I'm in an interaction with is not interested in actually exploring why they're saying what they're saying, me confronting them will be completely ineffective. The other side of that is I think the best way, if we're going to engage with a person, if that's the route we take, I would say that do it with somebody that you have a relationship with. Because then the relationship that you have with that person becomes the foundation of that interaction. Because if you just yell at somebody about it, they're not going to hear it. In many ways, I liken it to having a Facebook argument. It's not doing anything. But if it's somebody that we already have a meaningful relationship with, mutual respect with one another, we can have a better idea of where each other are coming from in that specific interaction. So if you're going to engage, I would make sure that you have a relationship first, that relationship can help guide the way that specific conversation can emerge.
Well, thank you, Dr. Couch, for the great presentation. Pete Peterson. And when I look at stereotypes and racism, I kind of draw back on my experiences in the military. And I remember many times that our Mexican soldiers be bilingual, and there's, we have to speak a common language sometimes in the military, but a lot of times when they're off alone by themselves, they would speak Spanish, and a lot of the soldiers would resent that. And why are they speaking Spanish? Are they talking about us? Mm-hmm. But how much do you contribute the language barrier to these type of stereotypes?
So the language barrier itself, I would not necessarily say helps to create the stereotypes, but I would say that at times the language barrier can prevent some of the increased opportunities for contact and that individuation, that it can be those can be more difficult tools to implement if we're having difficulty actually communicating with one another. That would be the way that I would tend to think about it. I would not necessarily suggest that the language barrier itself would help to construct these stereotypes outside of our inability to communicate. And then we get back into that attribution theory where we give people often negative attributes. It's similar to the common cultural saying that a woman who may go to a salon where the majority of workers in that space may be of Asian descent, and they're speaking in an indigenous tongue, mm-hmm. They will say, well, they're talking about me. They're probably talking about like their kids, right? They're probably just talking about their kids. Yeah. But we attribute those negative characteristics to the conversation.
Yes,
so the language barrier itself does not necessarily propagate the stereotypes, but the inability to form relationship and communicate does not help dissolve stereotypes.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great question.
Dr. Couch, I have two. One comment from Cindy Price. She just wanted you to know that you're a great orator. And Michelle Norman has a two-part question. Should institutional trainings be established as a universal requirement to combat systemic racism? If so, how should that be initiated or created?
Sure. So should a business or an institution be required to have D&I, diversity and inclusion training? For the world in which we exist, I would say that it is within even the businesses or the organization's best interest to have those types of trainings. The people moving out onto the job market are becoming increasingly diverse, and our ability, I don't know where to look for this question, our ability to communicate with one another in effective ways is incredibly important. So yes, I would say that having some sort of D&I training would be incredibly useful.
So my question would be, what are some suggestions you have for applying some of those techniques and theories that you talked about to the classroom and helping to propagate those discussions with students and talk about the importance of inclusion and diversity and different things like that within the classroom setting?
In the classroom setting, I think that what I call reflection assignments are wonderful. Asking students to take that step back and think about how they responded in a given situation. That our world is so busy that we're just moving, and we don't always take that time to say, well, why did I do that thing? Those types of small assignments, I think, can be great. Also, getting them to come in class and to talk about the reflection that they've done. Again, we have to talk more. So pushing students to engage with one another and to reflect on their own family lives to reflect on their own, to reflect on some of the stories they've been told as kids, I think is a very useful way.
Well, if all hearts and minds are clear, we're going to go ahead and end the fourth and final installment of the Cultural Conversation Series for this academic year. This is a big thank you from the Coalition to you all for attending, for making the time to come here or to listen online through live stream or to watch it back on our website. We are truly grateful and thank you for your time and your effort to include and increase your knowledge of cultural understandings. Thank you.